Breaking news Sahel. Burkina Faso launches construction of major oil refinery, a major stride toward energy sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré has officially begun construction on a national oil refinery. The landmark project signals a strategic move to reduce fuel dependency, capture more domestic value from natural resources, and strengthen economic independence. This isn't just infrastructure, it's self-determination in concrete and steel. In a development being closely watched across West Africa and far beyond, Burkina Faso has entered what officials describe as a decisive new phase in its economic transformation. Against a backdrop of rising global fuel prices, geopolitical realignments, and long-standing structural dependence on imports, authorities in Ouagadougou have confirmed the launch of construction works for a national oil refinery, an undertaking framed by the government as both an economic necessity and a political statement. At the center of the announcement is Ibrahim Traoré, who presided over the launch ceremony and used the moment to articulate a broader vision of energy sovereignty and national self-reliance. Speaking before government officials, engineers, labor representatives, and community leaders, Traoré characterized the refinery not merely as an industrial asset, but as a foundational pillar in a long-term project to reclaim control over strategic resources. According to statements broadcast by state media, the refinery is designed to process imported crude oil initially, with future adaptability for regional supply arrangements should upstream opportunities emerge within the Sahel. The facility is expected to produce gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and other refined petroleum products for domestic consumption, reducing the country's reliance on imported finished fuels that have historically drained foreign exchange reserves and exposed the economy to external shocks. For decades, Burkina Faso, like many landlocked African states, has been dependent on complex cross-border logistics chains for fuel supply. Refined petroleum products travel hundreds of kilometers by road from coastal ports, accruing transportation costs that ultimately filter down to consumers and businesses. Any disruption along these corridors, whether from market volatility, political instability in transit countries, or global supply crunches, has had immediate and sometimes severe consequences at home. Officials argue that the refinery project directly addresses this vulnerability by shortening the value chain and anchoring fuel production within national territory. Government planners involved in the project emphasize that the economic logic extends beyond fuel availability. By refining petroleum domestically, Burkina Faso aims to retain a larger share of value that would otherwise be captured abroad. Ancillary industries, maintenance services, chemical byproducts, logistics, and technical training are expected to grow around the refinery, potentially creating thousands of direct and indirect jobs. In a country where youth unemployment remains a pressing concern, the administration has highlighted skills transfer and local workforce participation as central objectives. The political messaging surrounding the project has been equally deliberate. In his remarks, Traoré linked the refinery to a broader philosophy of self-determination, invoking historical grievances tied to resource extraction models that left African countries exporting raw materials while importing finished goods at premium prices. The refinery, he said, represents a break with that pattern, a tangible assertion that Burkina Faso intends to process, transform, and benefit from strategic commodities on its own terms. International reactions have been cautious but attentive. Regional analysts note that while the construction of a refinery is a complex and capital-intensive endeavor, its symbolic value is significant in the current Sahelian context. Several countries in the region are reassessing long-standing economic arrangements and seeking to diversify partnerships, reduce exposure to external leverage, and assert greater autonomy over key sectors. Burkina Faso's move is widely seen as aligning with this trend, even as questions remain about financing structures, timelines, and long-term sustainability. From an infrastructure standpoint, preliminary details indicate that the refinery will be built with modular capacity, allowing for phased expansion as demand and technical capability grow. Energy ministry sources have suggested that initial throughput will prioritize national consumption, with any surplus potentially directed toward neighboring markets in the longer term. Such an outcome, if realized, would mark a dramatic shift for a country historically positioned solely as an end consumer within regional fuel networks. Critics, however, urge caution. Independent economists point out that oil refining margins can be thin, and that success depends heavily on efficient management, stable supply agreements, and rigorous environmental standards. Others highlight the need for transparency in procurement and contracting to ensure that the project delivers public value rather than becoming a fiscal burden. The government, for its part, insists that oversight mechanisms are being integrated from the outset and that lessons from other African refinery projects, both successful and troubled, are informing the planning process. Environmental considerations have also entered the national conversation. While the administration frames the refinery as a pragmatic response to current energy realities, it has acknowledged growing global pressure to transition toward cleaner energy systems. Officials argue that domestic refining does not preclude investment in renewables, but rather provides the economic stability needed to fund diversification into solar and other alternatives for which Burkina Faso has significant potential. In cities and rural communities alike, public reaction has been marked by a mix of optimism and guarded expectation. For many citizens, the refinery symbolizes dignity and agency, proof that the country can undertake complex industrial projects despite security challenges and limited resources. For others, enthusiasm is tempered by memories of stalled initiatives and unfulfilled promises from past development drives. Still, the prevailing mood reflected in local media and street interviews suggests that the project has struck a chord, tapping into a widespread desire for tangible progress and reduced dependence on external actors. Construction activities at the site are expected to accelerate in the coming months, with early groundwork already visible and logistical preparations underway. Engineers involved in the initial phase describe a demanding schedule shaped by climate constraints, supply chain coordination, and the need to synchronize multiple contractors. The government has pledged regular public updates as milestones are reached, framing transparency as essential to maintaining public trust. As the first foundations are laid, the refinery stands as a concrete manifestation of a larger debate unfolding within Burkina Faso and across the Sahel. How to reconcile immediate development needs with long-term sovereignty, how to balance pragmatism with ambition, and how to translate political will into durable economic structures. Whether the project ultimately fulfills its promise will depend on execution, governance, and regional dynamics that remain in flux. What is already clear, however, is that the refinery has reshaped the national conversation. It has reframed energy from a question of supply logistics to one of strategic control, and infrastructure from a technical matter to a declaration of intent. As steel rises from the ground and plans move from paper to practice, the country finds itself at a critical juncture, one where choices made today will reverberate through its economy, its politics, and its sense of national purpose for decades to come, and where the next phase of this unfolding story is only just beginning. As construction momentum builds, the refinery site has gradually transformed into one of the most closely monitored industrial zones in Burkina Faso. Heavy machinery operates from dawn to dusk, carving access roads, reinforcing foundational platforms, and preparing the ground for the installation of core processing units. For many local workers, the project represents their first exposure to large-scale industrial development, and training programs have been deployed alongside construction to ensure that technical skills are transferred rather than imported wholesale. Government engineers have emphasized that this emphasis on local capacity is deliberate. Rather than relying exclusively on foreign contractors, the refinery project is structured to integrate Burkinabe technicians, welders, electricians, and safety specialists at every stage. Officials argue that this approach not only lowers long-term operational costs but also creates a reservoir of industrial expertise that can be redeployed across future infrastructure projects. In internal briefings, the refinery is frequently described as a school as much as a site, an engine for human capital development as much as energy production. Within policy circles in Ouagadougou, the refinery has begun to influence broader economic planning. Transport ministries are revisiting fuel distribution strategies, anticipating a future in which refined products originate domestically rather than arriving by convoy from distant ports. Discussions are underway about rehabilitating storage depots, upgrading fuel stations, and rationalizing pricing structures to reflect reduced transportation costs. Though officials caution that consumer price reductions will not be immediate, the long-term objective is clear: insulating households and businesses from the sharp price swings that have repeatedly followed global market disruptions. The project has also introduced new diplomatic dimensions. Regional governments, particularly those within the Sahel, are quietly assessing what a functioning Burkinabe refinery could mean for their own energy security. While no formal export agreements have been announced, Analysts note that even limited cross-border supply could shift bargaining power within regional fuel markets. For a landlocked country historically dependent on its neighbors' infrastructure, the possibility of becoming a supplier, however modest, marks a profound inversion of roles. At the same time, international observers remain attentive to financing arrangements. Officials have confirmed that the refinery is being funded through a combination of state investment, strategic partnerships, and deferred payment engineering contracts, though precise figures have not been fully disclosed. The government insists that debt sustainability has been a central consideration, stressing that projected refinery revenues and savings on fuel imports justify the capital outlay. Skeptics, however, continue to press for greater transparency, arguing that public confidence hinges on clarity about costs, timelines, and returns. Security considerations, an unavoidable reality in the Sahel, have also shaped project planning. The refinery's location was selected with both logistical efficiency and risk mitigation in mind, and security perimeters have been integrated into the design rather than added as an afterthought. Authorities have framed this not as militarization, but as protection of a strategic national asset, an acknowledgement that energy infrastructure now occupies a central place in national resilience planning. Beyond economics and security, the refinery has begun to exert a subtle psychological effect. In public discourse, it is increasingly referenced alongside other state-led initiatives as evidence that the country is capable of pursuing ambitious goals despite external pressures. Radio debates, university forums, and social media discussions frequently return to the same theme: dignity through production. For supporters, the refinery is proof that sovereignty can be engineered, welded, and assembled through deliberate policy choices. For critics, it is a test case that will reveal whether rhetoric can withstand the unforgiving realities of industrial execution. Environmental questions continue to surface, particularly among civil society groups and urban youth movements. Government representatives respond by pointing to planned emissions controls, waste management systems, and compliance with regional environmental standards. They argue that importing refined fuel merely outsources environmental impact rather than eliminating it, and that domestic refining allows for stricter oversight and accountability. Still, these assurances remain part of an ongoing negotiation between development imperatives and ecological responsibility. As months pass, the refinery's skeletal structures begin to take shape, visible from surrounding roads and serving as a constant reminder that the project has moved beyond announcements into irreversible commitment. Each completed phase, foundation pouring, tank assembly, pipeline alignment, adds to a sense of momentum that officials are keen to maintain. Delays, they acknowledge privately, would carry not just financial costs but symbolic ones in a climate where public expectations have been deliberately raised. Inside government strategy documents, the refinery is increasingly framed as a keystone rather than an endpoint. Energy planners speak of downstream industries that could emerge once fuel supply stabilizes: fertilizer production to support agriculture, asphalt plants to accelerate road construction, and manufacturing sectors long constrained by high energy costs. In this vision, the refinery is less about oil itself and more about unlocking a chain reaction of industrial activity that reorients the economy away from raw extraction and subsistence dependence. Yet even as optimism grows, officials remain aware that the most difficult phase lies ahead. Construction, though complex, is finite. Operation is perpetual. The transition from building a refinery to running one efficiently, profitably, and transparently will demand governance discipline, technical rigor, and political restraint. Allies of the administration argue that this challenge is understood at the highest levels, and that early planning for operational autonomy is already underway. For now, the site continues to hum with activity, dust and steel rising under the Sahelian sun, each bolt tightened carrying weight far beyond its immediate function. The refinery has become a living narrative, one that intertwines national ambition, regional dynamics, and the enduring question of how a country defines control over its future. And as this chapter unfolds, it is increasingly clear that what is being constructed is not only an industrial facility, but a test of whether self-determination, once declared, can be sustained in practice as the story moves forward into its next phase. As the project advances from groundwork into visible structural progress, the national oil refinery is increasingly understood less as a single construction effort and more as a convergence point for multiple strategic ambitions. What began as a headline announcement has evolved into a sustained national undertaking that touches energy policy, fiscal planning, labor development, security doctrine, and regional diplomacy all at once. At its core, the refinery represents a calculated response to long-standing structural dependence. For years, fuel imports have acted as a pressure valve on the economy of Burkina Faso, amplifying inflation during global shocks and limiting policy flexibility. By relocating a critical segment of the energy value chain within national borders, the state is attempting to narrow that vulnerability. Even before completion, the logic of the project is already influencing how policymakers think about supply resilience, pricing mechanisms, and emergency preparedness. The leadership of Ibrahim Traoré has consistently framed the refinery as part of a broader correction of historical imbalances. In official communications, the emphasis is not placed solely on barrels per day or output volumes, but on agency, on the idea that controlling transformation is as important as accessing resources. This framing has resonated domestically, helping consolidate public support even among those who remain cautious about timelines and execution risks. From an economic standpoint, early indicators suggest that the refinery has already begun to generate secondary effects. Employment around the site has increased, local suppliers are being drawn into procurement chains, and vocational institutions are aligning curricula with refinery-related skills. While these impacts are still limited in scale, planners view them as proof of concept, evidence that industrial projects can act as catalysts long before they reach operational maturity. Regionally, the project has subtly shifted conversations about energy flows in the Sahel. Neighboring states, many of which share similar import dependencies, are watching closely. The refinery's eventual output capacity may not be large enough to redefine regional markets on its own, but its existence introduces a new variable, one that complicates traditional assumptions about who produces, who refines, and who sets terms. In this sense, the refinery's geopolitical weight may exceed its initial economic footprint. At the same time, unresolved questions remain central to public debate. Financing structures, operational governance, environmental safeguards, and long-term profitability continue to attract scrutiny. Supporters argue that these questions are inseparable from any serious attempt at structural transformation, while critics warn that symbolism must not outrun feasibility. The government's challenge has been to sustain momentum without dismissing legitimate concerns, a balancing act that will grow more delicate as construction gives way to commissioning and operations. Taken together, the refinery can now be summarized as three things at once: a physical infrastructure project, a policy instrument, and a narrative device. Physically, it is steel, concrete, pipelines, and processing units rising in stages. As policy, it is a lever aimed at reducing import dependence, stabilizing costs, and anchoring downstream industries. Narratively, it has become a symbol of intent, a way for the state to signal that it is prepared to absorb risk in pursuit of autonomy rather than defaulting to external reliance. What remains unresolved is how these layers will interact once the refinery moves closer to completion. The transition from aspiration to routine operation will test institutional capacity in ways that speeches and ceremonies cannot. Management efficiency, maintenance discipline, market integration, and regulatory oversight will determine whether the refinery becomes a durable asset or a cautionary tale. For now, the project stands at an intermediate moment, far enough along to reshape expectations, yet unfinished enough that outcomes remain open. It has already altered how energy, sovereignty, and development are discussed within the country, and it has begun to redraw how Burkina Faso is perceived within its region. The next phase will not be defined by groundbreaking or construction milestones, but by preparation for the more demanding chapter ahead, where ambition must translate into endurance, and where the refinery's true role in the national story will start to take clearer shape as the narrative continues to unfold. As the narrative reaches a natural point of closure, the refinery project can now be seen in full relief, not as a promise suspended in rhetoric, but as an irreversible course chosen by Burkina Faso at a moment of constraint and consequence. What matters most, observers note, is not whether the refinery instantly solves every energy challenge, but that it fundamentally alters the country's posture toward those challenges. Dependence is no longer treated as a given. It is treated as a condition to be engineered away. In the months leading up to commissioning, attention has steadily shifted from construction spectacle to institutional readiness. Technical audits, Safety drills, supply simulations, and governance frameworks now dominate internal discussions. This quieter phase lacks the drama of groundbreaking ceremonies. Yet it is here that success or failure will ultimately be decided. Officials speak less about symbolism and more about uptime, throughput, compliance, and cost recovery. Language that signals a transition from political statement to industrial discipline. The role of leadership has likewise evolved. Where Ibrahim Traoré once emphasized vision and resolve, his messaging increasingly underscores responsibility and stewardship. In recent remarks, he has stressed that sovereignty is not declared once, but maintained daily through competent management and accountability. This rhetorical shift has been interpreted by analysts as an acknowledgement that legitimacy in this phase will be earned not through defiance, but through delivery. Economically, projections remain cautious but grounded. Even partial displacement of imported refined fuels promises measurable relief for foreign exchange reserves and fiscal planning. More importantly, the refinery introduces predictability into a system long defined by uncertainty. For businesses, farmers, transport operators, and households, predictability can be as valuable as price reductions themselves, enabling planning, investment, and growth that were previously constrained by volatility. Socially, the project has already left an imprint. A generation of workers trained on-site carries forward skills that did not exist locally at this scale before. Educational institutions have adapted. Public expectations have recalibrated upward, not just toward this refinery, but toward what the state might attempt next. This psychological shift, away from resignation and toward conditional confidence, may prove to be one of the project's most enduring legacies. Regionally and internationally, Burkina Faso's refinery has reframed conversations about agency in the Sahel. It does not announce isolation, nor does it reject cooperation. Instead, it signals a desire to engage from a position of greater balance. Partners may change, markets may